And it has started. So welcome to this particular edition of the Conversation Club, the Global Conversation Club, held in conjunction with myself and the College of Performance Management from the US. Daryl Mesa there representing them today. A goodly attendance for this particularly significant Conversation Club, one that has its roots actually in the early days of the Conversation Club. About 5 years ago, we were at a Conversation Club in the exalted premises of Turner and Townsend, just opposite St Paul's Cathedral. And the proposition was made to this group of seniors from projects and programs and government and education that we should really have a project controls standard, a proper project controls standard for the UK initially, for the community at large. And a mere 5 years later of tortuous work, we actually managed to get one published via the BSI. We learnt the trials and tribulations of putting a national standard together. Also were very able to reduce what was amounting to nearly 200 pages of text down to about 20 or 30 to make it a usable, practical document. Of key significance is that this is the first ever standard produced by the Management Standards Group of the Management Standards Committee at the BSI. It's a specification standard, so it's full of shall and should statements. Not must, we can't say must, we can't mandate, but we can have shall and shoulds, which delineate the sorts of requirements that should be there for mobilizing, delivering, and also usefully assuring projects. So this was published sometime toward the end of last year, and in discussion it came up that Ben would have an opportunity to maybe road test this particular standard. So Ben was one of the original contributors to the standard in terms of its text. I've known Ben for many, many years. In fact, I think we first met when I ran some kind of earned value session in the EVA series. That must be about 20 years ago, easily.
A while ago, yeah.
Yeah, and we have stayed in touch above all again through Ben's activities within the Ministry of Defence on cost, and his work and activity within the PACE group, harmonising estimating practice through government and other major organisations. And here he is today to tell us about how 2025 stood up to actually being used.
Want me to share the bus stop? I could share the bus stop.
Oh, who's sharing a bus stop?
But if you need to shoot off, then.
Okay, well I'll mute that, and we'll come back then. Right, you're on, Ben.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Steve. I recognise a few names of the people on the call today. I'm not going to spend time giving you my CV and telling you my backstory. If you want to know more about me, my LinkedIn QR code's on the back end of the presentation deck, so you can use that and stalk me online. And if you don't know who ACOM are, I'll let you Google them. I'm not going to go into that. I'm really impressed that there are 50 people to come or give up their afternoon to come and listen about a standard. And I'm really impressed with that because, to be fair, standards are dull. And they need to be dull because they need to be precise, and therefore they tend not to make for very entertaining moments like the Conversation Club. So I'm not going to give you a clause by clause analysis of this document, and I'm sorry if that's what you were hoping for. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story which hopefully is a little bit more entertaining than a clausal analysis of the British Standard. So let's get on with the story. So back end of last year, there's a major construction project going on the other side of the world, and I'm not going to tell you who or what the project was because I want to be able to tell you the outcome and not embarrass people. You might work it out, fine. You can ask me later on, and I will either confirm nor deny. But suffice to say, large construction project in its design phase, and a new project director turns up. And he's surveying what's in front of him. And he's like, something's not right here. I'm not getting the information I need to know whether I can deliver this. So the first thing he did was to go and get a risk manager. Great, I fully support that. But he quickly worked out that's not enough to solve his problems. And normally at this point, people who are running big projects like this would probably pick up the phone to one of the top 4 consulting firms and ask for an independent kind of audit or review to be carried out. Well, this guy didn't do that. He reached out within AECOM. AECOM's in a joint venture with another company, so they reached out to the other company as well. And they selected from internally resources that they thought were appropriate to come and conduct what I'm going to call a maturity assessment. I might flip and use the words audit, but it didn't come with that, I'm going to say, status or accountability. Now, I happened not to be in the meeting when this was all decided. I got back in a day later and I said, Ben, or they said to me, Ben, you're off to Australia. Oh, thank you. What's this about? And I was given the backstory and kind of when I understood the nature of the project, it became clear as to why I was selected. So I thought, well, that's fantastic. Get to go and, miss some of the worst weather in the UK during January and go off to sunny Australia, where it was stupidly hot. And they were doing a road bike race as well, the Tour Down Under. Don't know how those guys got out in that heat. Anyway, so you'll hear me. Yep. Okay. So my first thing, having been an auditor in the past, I needed to work out as well, what standard am I going to use to conduct this maturity assessment against? And it just so happened I'd been invited to the December Conversation Club held in the Oracle offices. And one of the presentations there was by Val, who I think I saw on this call today. So hello, Val. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I'm nervous of who's in the audience here. There's a lot of hard work that's gone into the standard, and I really hope I meet your expectations. But at that meeting, Val went through the British Standard. And I knew it was coming, but I probably missed the headline news back in September when it got launched. So to know that it was actually on the streets was fantastic. And listening through Val's presentation, I was thinking, this is exactly what I need. I'm not going to go and take some kind of off-the-shelf kind of AECOM guide or from a joint venture, the other side. Or I wasn't going to take like a good practice guide. There was actually a standard I could use here. So this is where having the British Standard for me was really helpful. And I was very glad, the timing in this respect was perfect. And I said at the time, I said to Steve afterwards, there's an opportunity here to go and road test this. And I'll feedback how that works out. So this is that feedback moment. There were 3 main reasons why the standard really stood out for me. The first one, as Steve's alluded to, it uses shall statements throughout, and the shall statements are quite binary. It really helps to clearly identify where either something's been achieved or it hasn't. So for that reason alone, it's good to use a standard rather than a good practice guide, because otherwise you end up having a conversation saying, wouldn't it be a jolly good idea if you got a project controls manager recruited? Rather than being able to say, well, no, the guide, so the British Standard says that you shall have a project controls manager. Now, it's a different conversation at that point. Things become quite black and white rather than, that's a good idea. Yeah, maybe I'll write a project controls specification that we might use. So that bit was really important to me. The second part then that was really important to me was the way it was structured. Things rarely go wrong, in my experience, at the project level. When projects go wrong, there tends to be a bigger picture that's kind of set things up for the project veering away from its original parameters, shall we say. And this is where I think the standard's really good, because it looks outside of the project. It looks at the sponsorship. It looks at the organisation that's sponsoring the project. And it puts that in place right up front. If you don't have this, you don't have a valid project. So one of the first questions that I asked of the project director when I was asked to come and do this. I said, with what authority am I conducting this assessment? Who am I reporting to? Who's actually going to take this and do something with it? Because I'm not going to waste my time producing a report that sits on a shelf somewhere. And he was very clear. He says, Ben, you're accountable to me. So you're separate from your ACOM line management, and you're going to tell me what's going on. And from that point of view, it's like, okay, we've got something that can work here. There was clear accountability, and he was taking the full ownership of the project. And we'll come into that kind of whole sponsor organizational piece a bit more later on. So that was the second reason, was the broader context. And the third reason is this British standard is about producing reports. It's not about producing dashboards. It's all about making decisions. And for me, that's fundamental in what we do. If we are not enabling project managers and sponsors to make decisions about their projects with good information, then arguably we failed. It doesn't matter how pretty your dashboard is. It doesn't matter how great your AI pretends to be. It's decisions, and that's at the heart of it. And if you're not making decisions, you're not managing your project, and at that point it will veer off the rails. So moving on, I've got a standard. Brilliant. Now, in a past life, I was a lead auditor conducting audits against a ship safety management policy in what was then Defence Procurement Agency, the DPA. Crikey, it's showing my age a little bit now. For those of you that remember DPA. And when you conduct an audit, you identify the clause that somebody's not compliant with. So you'll go and look for the evidence that a particular document or process has been followed. You'll look at the records and such like. And you end up with an outcome like this. And I was reflecting on this, going, this isn't going to be really particularly inspiring for the project director when I give a report with a list of clauses from the standard that says, well, you're not compliant against this, you're not compliant against that. And I was starting to worry and going, I need to find a way of bringing this to life, because the traditional audit approach isn't going to work. And I was doing some due diligence in terms of what I was getting into and finding out a bit more about the project. And I was speaking to one of the engineers on the project, a lead design engineer for one of the particular areas. And he was talking about the safety case, again, going back to my time in the Ship Safety Management Office. And he was talking about the claims argument evidence approach, and a kind of a light bulb went on in the back of my head. I go, hang on, we haven't spoken about this for years, but there's something in this that I might be able to use. This came out back in the late 90s, an organisation called Adelard in the UK. You had things like gold structure notation. It was all really big at the time. But the fundamentals were so sound that you can structure your argument to prove a point. So, for example, here you might have a claim that a particular capability is safe to operate. And then your arguments below would be around, well, I've got a requirement that states certain safety standards need to be achieved. I've got a design that achieves those standards. I've got a verifiable manufacturing process that produces a quality output. I can have my commissioning as part of that. I could look at my maintenance. I could look at my training. So you start to build together the arguments that says that something's safe. And then the next level down is then looking for the evidence that supports that. Great in a safety world. How does it work in the project controls world? And this is what I was thinking about in the new year as I was preparing to go out. So if you're going to screenshot anything today, this is probably the one. Everything else is just pretty pictures to kind of give you something to look at whilst I witter on. So for me, reading the standard and my own experience, I come back to what's the primary claim. And the one that I've proposed, again, different days, different coffee, different people will come up with a different structure. But this is what I went with. So control system is mature enough to provide timely, reliable decision support to the sponsor and PM. I like to think that is at the core of the standard, and I'm happy for somebody to tell me I'm wrong. But that's certainly what speaks to me and what I read, and come back to you. That was one of my main reasons for using the standard. Underneath that, I see 4 key arguments that support that. And I think for anybody who's been working in controls long enough, these kind of are almost obvious, isn't it? you have to have your leadership in place. You need to have a baseline. You need to operate effective controls, and then you need that feedback loop where you're testing whether the project is still viable in terms of delivering its benefits, but also looking to learn and improve processes. That in itself wasn't quite enough. I needed to break those arguments down a little bit more. But what was interesting is those arguments that I determined neatly aligned to the key clauses within the British standard. Now, whether that was chance or whether it was by design, because by this stage I've been reading the standard many, many times thinking, how am I going to present this to the project director to make sense? So there's a number of sub-arguments underneath that. Then those sub-arguments, I then kind of said, well, what's the evidence that I'm looking for? So I undertook that clausal analysis of the shall statements. Now, I think Val said, and I stand to be corrected, I think it was about 81 shall statements in the standard, if I remember correctly. Trouble is, some of those saying you shall do such and such, and then there's a long list of stuff underneath it. So 80 was probably a little light. Again, the coffee that I was drinking that day and the way I analysed it, I came up with 177 individual requirements that I can go and look for evidence against. So that's great. I've got a standard. Admittedly, I'm importing a British standard into Australia, which might get a little bit of pushback, but at least I'm not taking a guide or something that I've made up. So that was good. I've got a way of structuring it now to bring those requirements of the standard to life and make it really meaningful. Problem is, I've got 177 requirements. Can you imagine going into an hour-long meeting trying to get through 177 requirements? Yeah, that's about 20 seconds per requirement. That's just not going to work. So I needed to kind of really bring this down to something manageable. So I did a couple of things. The standard talks about tailoring. I think it's in section 5.1 off the top of my head. What I did is I looked at these requirements and I said, of these requirements, given the project and what I know of the project, which ones do I think are foundational? Without these requirements, there's no chance that the control system will work. Then I came up with a term called core, which kind of like, actually, these are important things. You do need them for a functional system. Supporting, and then advanced. Again, that's what I came up with on the day and what I thought felt was appropriate to the project that I was looking at. And you'll recall on the previous slide, you can see here, I had phase 1 priority. I decided to also split the maturity assessment in half, because actually, if you don't have your leadership in place and you don't have a baseline, the other two are out the window. There's no point looking at arguments 3 and 4 if you don't have the first two in some level of maturity. So that helped me get down to 23 what I call foundational requirements that allowed me to assess those first two requirements. So during I call the opening interview or the briefing I gave to the leadership team on the project, we looked at all 23 of these and we said, are you happy that these are the right ones to start with? Is there anything that you want to take out? I think the only one we had a discussion around was kind of the environmental and sustainability piece, given the nature of the project and where it was in its design phase. It was felt that actually that wasn't a priority for us. So great. I've got a standard. I've got a way of selling it, and I've got it down to something manageable. Ready to start the audit, aren't I? I'm ready to go and interview people. Not quite. To get the best out of the people that you're going to speak to, you need to actually spend a bit of time doing some preparation. So again, I've already spent several weeks looking at this by now, because this is not trivial, getting all those requirements listed out and structured and such like. I needed a way of looking at the questions and making sure that the right people are asking the right questions. There's certain things that really only the program or project director is in a place to answer. There's only certain things that the scheduler is best placed to answer. So depending on who it was we were interviewing, I would prioritize those questions to look for the evidence. And kind of the secondary questions was then looking for supporting evidence, the stuff I've asked other people. Am I getting a consistent story? But I also then departed further from my original ISO training in the fact that I wasn't just looking for documentary evidence. I was looking for behavioral evidence. So it's all very well saying, yep, here's my project controls specification. This is how I run a QSRA. That's lovely. But do you talk about it? So sitting in on the management meetings and listening to people within the office, being embedded within the team, helped us get a flavour of whether the processes that we were looking at, I was just being shown shelfware, and it's a really easy way to get rid of an auditor is just show them documents, or were they living it? And that living it piece was more important. So I was looking for documentary evidence, but also that behavioural evidence. Great. One more thing. So I'm still not ready to start yet. You think I might be there by now. I have that suspicion that maybe not everything's going to be okay. So normally you would start by asking quite an open question. I flipped this and I asked a very closed question. I said, have you got a project controls plan, for example? The answer is either yes or no. If you're doing a traditional audit, if the answers are no, you stop and just say non-conformance, carry on. In this one, if I got a yes, great, let's have a look at it. Let's see how good it is. Let's go and test its quality. If the answer was no, we flipped the conversation to one around, well, what's the benefit of having this document? Or this process? How might we put this process in place? What are the barriers and things that we need to overcome? What are the benefits of having it? And through doing that, I was starting to shift the organization in terms of their mindset because they've been actively engaged, but also the recovery plan was starting to write itself. So I'm not in a position now where I'm going to go back with a load of non-conformances. I've actually got a recovery plan that's starting to be built from the people I'm talking with. And one of the things I loved about this conversation was people sharing some of the things that they do. And something that's so obvious now that I've never seen in the past was talking to one of let's call them a control account manager for the sake of common terminology. And they kept referring to their plans on a page by theme. So there would be like a Christmas theme, a Hollywood theme, a Everglade theme, a fairy theme. It's like, what are these themes about? Well, every time they produced a new plan on the page, they changed the color palette. So it was really obvious to people within their team that the plan had changed and they needed to look at what has moved and how they need to modify their own activities to support it. So simple, yet I spend my whole life looking at blue bars with yellow ones underneath. And for somebody to change the color, I don't know, for me, I was just like shocked. Like, why are we not doing that? So there's a tip. Change the color of your plan to help your team understand that the plan's changed. Okay, so the audits are going on. Getting lots of notes, really good. One of the things that came up, and I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but I was using terminology around sponsor and project manager and project controls manager and control account manager. And I sensed some confusion, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it about, well, what aren't people getting here? Why does this not make sense to them? And turns out these sorts of terms that I see in almost everyday life, they didn't have an equivalent. So it was almost like I was talking a different language. So I think the only item I'm going to put on the table today is an area for consideration of an up issue of this document is looking at some of these roles in the context of a supplier. These roles make perfect sense in a client organization for major projects. But when you're the supplier, actually your goals are slightly different. Yes, you're trying to align with the client's project, but actually your goal, your sponsorship internally is like, am I going to make a profit? Is there benefit for our shareholders in undertaking this work? And that bridge wasn't quite there. It is if you look really closely at the text and think about it. I suggest we can make it a bit easier. That's my only comment. Other than that, I think the whole thing's fantastic. So anyway, we got there in the end, and this is for the project I was looking at. This is how it mapped across. So on with the story. So rather than having that really boring non-compliance statement at the end of the audit, I was able to say, I was able to bring that non-compliance to life by actually saying how it impacts their business. Yeah, so they didn't have a project controls manager. And I say, well, you don't have the right people appointed, and without that, you're not going to be able to support that argument that you've got. So support the argument of having the people in place, and therefore the claim of your control system is fundamentally undermined. So that was good. However, this is the outcome of those 23 functional requirements that I spoke about earlier. Only one of them was met. And even then I got a little bit of challenge at the back end, because they made an argument, say, well, it's met over there, but you didn't really meet it over there. I was like, I was trying to give you some good news, guys, but now it's not to say that everything was a complete failure and it was out of control. The one thing they did get right is they knew what they needed to deliver. They were very clear about what deliverables had to go out the door. So, there's a significant tick in the box. But many other areas around having a specification of what you want the control system to do, having the people in place, none of it was there. But there were pockets of good practice, not just a colourful plan on a page, but people were doing risk management. They did have schedules. They did have cost breakdown structures and cost collection. Because if you don't have cost collection, you can't do your billing. So there were certain functional things that worked. But there was no scaffolding. There was no framework that pulled it all together. And one of the fundamental questions that you've got as a project director is, am I going to get my deliverables out the door on time with the resources available to me? Well, he knew what he was trying to get out the door, but that was about it. So there you go. There you go. I said, that's it. What do we want to do now? And the reason why I had this kind of phase one at the start is I suspected things might not have been great. And for a project early in the design phase, as teams are growing, it's not a surprise to see this. So we had an off ramp after the first week that basically said, when we get to the end of the first week, we've got 3 options. Well, actually 4 options. The 4th option is Ben is sent home, never to return to Australia. But the 3 useful options is we carry on with the kind of the maturity assessment, and we look for breadth. We go and look at the other 2 arguments that I hadn't touched on. And that would have made a lot of sense if I was seeing the foundations in the first 2 arguments, the evidence to support it. The second option would have been to have gone deeper on the first 2. So kind of go for depth rather than breadth, and go and look at some of those core and supporting requirements. The third option is to stop and fix what is broken. Well, we chose the third option. So my second week was flipped from doing more interviews and maturity assessment to actually, let's go and help the project get better. So let's have a look at what that involved. And this is where the standard kind of helped me out again, because I'd already used it for the assessment. But one of the things that was missing was a control specification. Well, to be fair, when you've got this standard in your hand, your control specification pretty much writes itself. There's a few things you'd expect to tailor around governance, drum beats, and thresholds for going through change and such like. And obviously, you've got to get your that linkage between the sponsor and the project director, kind of that naming piece right. But the specification pretty much wrote itself. And I've probably picked up there wasn't a PCM, so they needed a job description for the project controls manager. Well, if you look in Annex A of this document, it details the kind of accountabilities of the key people in the project controls environment. So I was able to take that and flip it to kind of the context of the project, say, well, this is what the job involves. The bit I did layer on the top, and forgive me, I'm going to talk about professional qualifications for a second, is to put that bit in there. It's really important to me that as a profession, we recognise people that are competent. It's a bit like an engineer. You wouldn't have an engineer working, signing off things if they weren't chartered. Well, why do we allow decisions to be made on multi-billion-pound projects when your controls people aren't demonstrably competent? And that's why I think CASA is fantastic. That's where my allegiance is at the moment. They provide that. There are other professional bodies out there as well. But what I did do, and I wasn't, it wasn't just CASA I put in there, but I put that professional recognition requirement in there to say this is the standard that we're looking for. I don't know about everybody else, but the number of CVs that I see that, you know, somebody says, yeah, I'm amazing at project controls, earned value management, CPI, SPI, I've got all of that. And then actually when they get in the room, it's like, I'm not sure you bear any resemblance to what's on that CV. I mean, just having that professional piece, even if somebody is at the lower level of their accreditation, it really helps to understand the quality of the person that you're getting in. Anyway, I'll get off that soapbox. If you want to get me back on it, I'm at the CASA conference tomorrow, repeating this presentation. So the specification for me has helped not only conduct that maturity assessment, but actually then go back and build the team up again. Right, penultimate slide, just in case you were wondering when you're going to get a break. This symbolizes the meeting that I didn't have. And on reflection, this is probably the one thing I would have done differently. Whilst I had an opening meeting with the leadership team to validate the standard that we were using, to go through the functional requirements where we were focusing our effort, what I didn't do was have a session with the broader team to say, this is what we're coming to do. These are the sorts of questions that we're going to answer, and this is what we're trying to achieve. So when people came into the room, they were a little bit nervous because they didn't quite know what to expect. And this session, half an hour, probably with some donuts and coffee, because I don't see how I'm going to get people in a room who aren't in the project control space to come and talk about a standard. So a bit of bribery. And I think that would have helped just to kind of smooth the way. So as it turns out, I'm still employed by ACOM, even though the result of the maturity assessment wasn't great. They were grateful and they have proceeded. They've now got themselves a PCM in place, and they are starting to run their control system more fully. So maybe I'll get an opportunity to go and do a reassessment next year. But there you go. Thank you very much for your time. It's horrible doing this on Teams with no cameras on. I've got no idea whether people are sleeping, whether they're happy. So please break silence, ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Ben. Okay, well, there's a hand gone up, so we've got a bit of time. You happy to talk for a while, Ben?
Yes, as long as they're not too difficult, at which point my connection might go a bit dodgy.
Yes, you can go muted then. So was it...
if people can turn their cameras on when I'm talking, and I can see Val clapping, that means a lot to me, Val, because you were presenting at in December time. So
Conversation Club, yeah. Okay, so first off, is that Nermeen there, Latif?
Yep.
Hi.
It is. Thank you.
Just could you tell us where you're from, Latif?
Yep.
Which organisation?
So I'm from WSP and background in program management, PMO controls for 25 years. So my question is around, so I've worked in lots of big programs and tend to have gate reviews and maturity assessments and, following things from, there are some P3M3 maturity assessments. So what's the kind of differentiator? When do you do which route? Is this kind of more for certifying your project controls element of that, because there are some crossovers to other kind of techniques?
Yeah, so in the situation that I was looking at, we're part of a much bigger program, so they have all their governance to go through in terms of what we'd recognize as strategic cases, outline business cases, FBC and such like, or whatever the Australian equivalent is. They've changed the names slightly, but I was looking at it from the context of a design engineering consultancy. So their gateways really was, well, actually we've signed a contract, so we're going to deliver something, and at this point in time the client hadn't issued any requirements around project controls. I think I lie, there was a line that says give a monthly report. Literally that was it. I was like, okay, that's a pretty easy ask. But they had another consultancy in supporting them, and I knew some of the people from back in the UK, and I said it's not going to be long before they've upped their game and they're asking some really difficult questions. So in this context, it was about getting the team match fit for what was coming and the next phase of the design piece. It wasn't tied into a gated approach, because obviously that client's got their own approach here. So we saw an opportunity to kind of help lead the client on this one. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. So that would be kind of like the mobilization aspect and making sure that it was good to go. That's good. This maturity assessment.
But we were already mobilized. We had, over 100 people working on this already. But we were moving into the next phase, and with the amount of money being spent, and I come back to the start. This is where the new project director was sufficiently uncomfortable with what was in place. He's saying, no, I need to up my game. He saw the need. It wasn't yet being driven by the client, which is probably the better place to be, is to have somebody who recognizes the value of controls. So we can all be grateful for that. Yeah. That's why he was chasing it down.
Oh, great. All right, Ian, I see your hand up.
Hi. Thanks, Ben. You sort of subdivided it to these 23 requirements that you were looking at, and I think you had 22 and a bit non-conformances in effect that you didn't find sufficient evidence that they were going on. Was that sort of absolute, or was it that you were looking for certain sorts of evidence, and they may have argued, well, we have a definition of that, but it's very low key. The definition is those people get in a room, some of them talk about preventative and corrective actions, and they agree what to do. So you could say that was reporting and acting on preventative and corrective actions, but it might not have been a sort of written communication. So where were these NCRs? Were they sort of
there
nothing
weren't
at all?
There was nothing. A lot of client changes were coming through ad hoc conversations, and the engineers are like, oh, they want it in, I don't know, a different height now. Well, the client's asked for that, so we'll go and do it at a different height. I'm like, okay, so where's the engineering configuration around this? Where's the impact assessment? I was literally sitting in the first meeting, and the engineering director said, yep, we're changing the height of a particular thing. I was like, you've had an assumption that I've already read that says that's not changing. And then the first meeting's like, literally a lot of that stuff wasn't there. It was all being done on goodwill. And with the amount of change, and I've seen it elsewhere on these complex projects, if you don't get a grip of change and effectively communicate it, it all falls apart.
And that was the sort of follow-up bit, that there's a time in a project which is creative and messy, and the concept of a baseline makes no sense. Or you can put sort of you end up writing memos to yourself to prove it, and signing your own change thing and communicating to yourself. So that there's a decision at which we put in place scope baselines, and from here on in, we will switch the change control on. And that would seem to be the challenge of design input, because it spans that sort of decision making. How did you cope with that when what you were looking is?
I love the fact you used the phrase scope baseline. I've been on a few projects now when one of the first things I ask for is, where's your WBS dictionary? Where's the scope defined? I don't need one of those. Yeah, you do, because everything hangs off that.
Yeah, but whilst you're developing it, there's an argument. So we don't switch formal control on until we have got to the stage at which it's taken enough shape to it runs in different directions, and you have to control change for different reasons.
And sometimes you need a change in leadership for somebody to recognize that time has now passed. And it's probably easy in hindsight to recognize that we're at a stage where something needs to be regularized and controls put in place. When you're in the trenches at the time, do you think you can really see it? So I think this is where the maturity of the leadership, and probably come back to the terminology around the sponsor and the sponsoring organization, taking that step back and going, you really need some controls in there now. You're kind of, as your phrase, through the messy bit. You understand broadly what you're delivering now, right? Let's get this stuff nutted down. I think they possibly in this project have left it a little late, but they could have left it a lot later. So, you know, it was a good time to be gripping this nettle and getting on with it. But yeah, if they left it much longer, I think they would have had the client breathing down their neck demanding this stuff. And it's much harder, I think, when you're on the back foot trying to respond to requests and make up information if you haven't taken the time to get your scope nailed, set a good baseline, etc. So
Thank you.
I suppose we've
Thank-
got the messiness of contract change and project change just to make it more interesting.
yes, we can spend a long time talking on that one.
Thanks, Ian. Breeder.
Hi,
Hello.
Ben. Thanks, Breeder Ryan Jacobs, Capability Director. Thanks for a great conversation. It was very riveting, and I'm sure tomorrow's presentation will go down a treat. We didn't find it in the slightest bit dull. I can assure you, we
Thank you.
found it riveting. I have a really intriguing question for you, prepping you for all the hard ones you get tomorrow. In your review of your maturity assessment, given there are obviously some pain points in the history there, what would be your number one pain point to articulate? And do you believe the standard now addresses that or helps you address that?
So the first thing that we went afterwards in terms of a corrective plan was to write a specification. What is it that you need your control system to do? Because without having that written down, what is it that the program director needs or project director needs to know? Because I think without that, you're kind of just making it all up. Yeah, I'll go and recruit a project controls manager. Fantastic. What's he going to do? Don't really know. I haven't written that down yet. So I really see taking that time to write down what you want that system to do. And it might mature over time. Yeah, there's always going to be areas where you add more detail, but that's fine. But you need to have a starting block that's reflects the maturity of the project and where it is at that point in time. Yeah. So again, going back to Ian's point about the messy phase. So we're not going to be doing QCRAs, QSRAs. You know, that's just a waste of time because you probably don't even know what your scope is, let alone having a risk register. So that's what we went after first. And then off that, everything else kind of you had an argument for, you know, why do I need a project controls manager? Well, this is the process I need to be running. Yeah. So that's where we started. So they've got that now. And they've got a PCM now. So they're off and running.
Excellent. Thank you.
Of course, the different organizations, different people, dare I say different coffee again, people might say start somewhere else.
Thanks, Breeder. Oh, another one.
So I've got one more. I think a
Yeah,
couple
go.
of members of my team are on here as well.
Mhm.
So we're all very interested in data, and NISTA published a data standard. So it's kind of starting to say what the sorts of things are. So does that link in nicely with this standard? Does it go down to that level and say, is it more you must have one, or does it talk about the things that you'd have in there?
My recollection on this particular point, this standard is not prescriptive. Obviously, the hooks are in there to say you must have this stuff defined. I stand to be corrected from somebody who's possibly closer and memorizes the material better than I have. But I have been reading the estimating standard that's in development right now, and those hooks are in there in terms of those standard cost breakdown structures and such like. So I would argue that's probably a level of detail that's too much for this standard. And this standard, I think, sits at that right level. That's looking around, you know, the organisation, the leadership, and the broader controls piece. I mean, I didn't get into talking about the earned value management standard, which is still really relevant, but it's one of your tools that sits within the broad controls piece, and we don't repeat that here. And I think it's the same with kind of these cost breakdown structures and stuff coming out from NISTA. It integrates into this system, and all of the hooks are in this standard to do that. You've obviously setting up your specification. You just need to write this stuff down and go, yep, that's how we're going to work it. Now, that might come from your client as a requirement. It might be something that you internally as an organization subscribe to. But the standard doesn't prescribe it, unless anybody wants to correct me.
Perfect. Thank you.
I don't think it specifically goes down to that level, Ben, but it allows for consideration of those ideas. And for some reason, I thought that Val might put her hand up. So, hello, Val. Val again was very deeply involved in bringing this to final publication, and was a core member of the the drafting team. So, Val?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I really have much of an answer to that, other than we were trying to keep the standard as high level of technical requirements. And, apologies if there's noise here. I'm outside. I'm travelling at the moment. So, there was a need to try to reduce the level of prescription, and as you said, Ben, to make sure that people tailor it. And as soon as you get down to a level of exactly what we should collect, then you're getting into guidance, not into requirements. And I think leading on from that, I had two questions for you, or observations. They might be questions. You mentioned potential improvements to standards. I totally agree with you that there are issues with how people recognise themselves in the standards. And when you came down to the contracting organisation, people didn't immediately see themselves as this being applicable to them. But I think that might be, it could be an annex, or it could be some guidance, rather than trying to shoehorn that into the requirement specification. Otherwise, you try to make it applicable to all people and all things, and then you just make it into a mess. And it was really trying to keep it concise. The thing I found really interesting was your comment on assessing behaviour, because that is so fundamental in any organisation. Project controls is absolutely it's a major part of it. Very difficult to put that into a requirement specification, because you must only put in a requirement that you can verify, and that sort of means it needs to be measurable. And how you measure behaviour is almost impossible. So perhaps it's the sort of thing, again, that we should work out. How does one get that into the psyche of the person who's assessing, auditing? Have you got any thoughts? Because it cannot go in as a requirement, because it just isn't. It's a judgment on behaviour, not a measurable thing. Thanks.
I think something, yeah, I get the challenge completely, and I had to be very open and transparent to not get thrown out of Australia sooner than my permit allowed. And it's through just being factual. Like, the behaviours that I observed was, I'll go back to the one of the engineering director with a particular height being changed. And so you do realise that's one of your, I've been looking at your risk register and such like, and said, well, that was one of your key assumptions. He goes, I didn't know it was a key assumption. So I'm like, right. So not only was there no written change control around this, you just announced it in a meeting. You're not using your risk register as part of the routine. And you can see then that was a really crystal clear case of saying, well, there's just processes that actually don't exist anyway. Even if they did, it's out of control and things aren't being communicated. I think to some extent, then that behavioural piece, you're looking at the experience of the person that's coming in to do the assessment. So this is why I don't think you can give people checklists. And it's when the NAO turn up and they're really easy to get rid of. Have I got anybody from the NAO on the call?
Spotted any, I don't think.
No. They were in Steve's conference the other week, but they left the room, and I thought they'd all gone, but one was left behind. But yeah, you just NAO, you just give them documents. And actually the real answer from what I've experienced is the conversations that are going on in the background and how the decisions were really reached. And that's, where quite often the auditors aren't privy to that. So by calling it a maturity assessment, it gave me a different access to the team, and just to see what the culture was like. And I personally, this is one where kind of experience and war wounds comes in. That you can make those suggestions back to the project director and have that open conversation and say, not only have you not got the process, actually the behaviours that we're seeing here aren't setting the right examples from your leadership, and we need to address that, as well as the other piece. I'm not sure everybody can have that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart way of doing it. I would agree that calling it maturity assessment is a smart move, not calling it an audit, because especially in the early stages. And Ian, I agree with you. Things are very messy at the beginning of projects, but you don't have to have rigid change control still to have change control. I would see an assumptions log as something you still have to be mindful of. If it's in the assumptions log and suddenly you're going to break that assumption, then that needs to be subject to a question of it being a change. So it's whether you're talking about it. You can have a standard which is very rigid in terms of a set of requirements. It's how you apply it and the practicality of it and the stage of the project that's very important. And that goes back to your comment, Ben, about the fact that it early on in the document, I think it makes a very big statement about being tailorable. And how you go about using it is entirely up to you. BSI does not do compliance and assessments itself. That's for other people to take the requirement standard and go away and build their own credentials or qualifications or whatever they want to do. That's not something that BSI does. Steve, put me right if I've got the wrong description of it there. But I thought it was a really interesting presentation. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Val. Appreciate that coming from you.
Yeah, I think.
Hey, Austin.
Yeah, Austin.
Hi, Ben.
Oh, yeah, long time no see, mate.
How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Awesome.
Had a nice trip to Australia. Did you hear about it?
That's all right. How you doing? I thought thanks for the presentation. It was really good to hear all that you did and the process and stuff. But I guess the question is on if you had the opportunity to also assess the knowledge, skills, and competencies of the people working on the project, because it's one thing to say that in some cases that they do not have the right behaviors, but could it also be that they didn't have the right knowledge or skills of what they need to be doing, which now presents itself as a lack of, as a lack in behaviors.
So I didn't call anybody out for not being competent. Everybody I spoke to, and it's rare to find anybody in these sorts of jobs today where they don't have a background of some kind of experience in project management. So they know you need a schedule. Yeah, people know you need to collect costs, otherwise you don't get paid. Yes, so the fundamentals were there, and people were doing what they needed to do to fill the gaps. Things like risk management tend to be allowed to slide, but do we know what we need to deliver? When do we deliver it by? Who's working on it? That resource planning piece. But it's happening at a very low level, and it's siloed. And that's what was. I didn't think it was a competence issue. I saw, as I said, I saw some really great work, and another very good P6 planner. Somebody's super fast on using P6. Yet again, it's like, wow, okay. It was the framework. It was getting everybody to pull on the same journey to then give one view that says, this is where this project is at right now. These are the deliverables that are at risk. This is where we're prioritizing our resources. It was all being done in pockets. So the knowledge was there. People were managing their own little bits. But when you start looking at budgets, and we talk, lots of conversations around contingency. There was no contingency. Yes, there was. It was all hidden down at the bottom. Yeah, everybody knows how long it takes to change a light bulb, so we'll just allow a bit more time. But as far as telling the client or the leadership, no contingency here. Move on. We're stripped to the core. And that was it. So I personally felt there was nobody that was in a role that they shouldn't be doing. It was more about setting a framework for them all to work together.
Processes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Cool. Cheers,
Thanks,
Austin.
Thanks, Austin. Tom Lucas. Hello.
Hi. Thanks very much. That's really interesting. My followed on really from Austin, because it's quite common that you see sort of lots of skilled people in organisations, but the framework doesn't exist, or the organisation is So you might have cost managers working with commercial, planners working with delivery, and I just so your example was within your own organisation, but I just wondered whether the standard would be useful if you were sort of a client trying to change a contractor's organisation to make a better sort of project controls framework, so that people.
So when I was working in defence equipment and support, and we were standing up project controls, we wrote a project control standard, and we said to our supply chain, "Here you go, guys, implement this, please." Well, of course, we reinvented the wheel.
Yeah.
This British standard kind of fills that gap and say, "Look, here's a standard," so you can now give that to your supply chain and say, "Well, we want you to follow this. However, to make it relevant to what we're doing, this is what we're going to ask you to tailor." It's a bit like taking an NEC contract, putting your Z clauses in. So I would, certainly in a client position, take this and use that as my effective baseline. Yeah. And I say, okay, so what now needs to change to make this relevant to my program? What do I need as a client that where I'm going to change it? And then I would then cascade that without having to invent my own standard and put my own badge in, because one of the challenges, you imagine as a supplier, you've got a lot of clients out there. If they've all got their different standards, you're like, well, I've got to now work out if I'm compliant with that one. And is it the same as that one? They've all got nuances.
Yeah.
This just aligns it all. Yeah. It's so, from my point of view, I think it's really good. But I wouldn't just take it out of the box and just dump it in there and say, conform to this standard. Yeah. I think that would create noise that you don't need. You need to be intelligent about it.
Right. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. So maybe Ian could well be our final, unless anybody else has got any more. But go ahead, Ian, please.
Okay. I was going to write something, but there's no written chat available, so I thought I'd stick my hand up. That throwaway comment, Ben, about at the senior level believing there's no slack or fact or contingency in this project. Didn't that let off some big red flashing whoop 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 alarms? That sounds like a big alert to me, because of course, as you said, you've got contingency. The question is, do you want to see it and manage it, or do you want to pretend it's not there and not know about it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions we were asking is, when it came to change management, who's signing off the changes? Or if they couldn't agree. I was like, so project director, it's all got to be me. Okay, so that $100 change, you want to sign that off? Oh no, I don't want to do that one. Right, so where's the threshold? Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
So all of these things need to be worked through, and that recognition that, we've got no contingency. I think, no, you've got to be honest about these things and be honest with your client to say, I mean, you might be this was a cost reimbursable contract and that can set off behaviors that, whilst as and that makes sense in that messy phase, doesn't it? We don't know what the outcome is going to be or when we're going to achieve it, but paying for the effort that goes in is reasonable. And then as things get better defined, you're coming into where you've got a plan, you can actually now start changing your kind of payment methods. You can maybe, might end up in a fixed price scenario with better control. But I think this idea that there's no contingency in there will be there somewhere. And it's about being able to be honest and creating a culture where people can be honest about it. Because everybody will sandbag things. Even if I ask my kid when he's going to empty the dishwasher, I'll get it done by such and such a time,
And at least half of the standard, as I understand it, takes the sponsoring, owning organisation's perspective. So it's not just both the project delivery managers, but it's or suppliers supporting the project. As I read the standard, its overarching position is it's owner, funder, sponsor centric rather than participant, and I'm assuming that brought tensions in. Did you observe that you're barely 1 out of 23? It sounds like a symptom that the project itself didn't have a project plan or project execution plan. I would expect the project controls aspects of the standard to be an integral part of your project execution plan.
But as I said, so you had a joint venture that stood up. They hadn't worked this stuff out. They'd just being led by engineers who had got on with the fun stuff, who were working on a very difficult engineering problem. And it was only when he's got a project director in who wasn't an engineer. Well, actually, he was an engineer, but he's obviously moved on and matured.
I was going to say some of the best PMs I know used to be engineers.
Am I allowed to say that you mature as from being an engineer into a PM? I don't know, but yeah, he had a different mindset, and he was able to stand back and not get so excited about the engineering. I mean, my background as an engineer, so when I was being briefed on this, I was like, "This is amazing." Let's talk about the engineering for like 2 hours. I eventually had to pull myself back out. Sorry, so back to your question then around. No, I've lost it. I've gone off on a tangent.
Was it a symptom of lack of control and overarching management across the whole project, not just in project controls?
That was the fundamental. There was nothing there. There was nothing from the client, nothing from the sponsoring the parent companies, because they were getting paid. It was cost plus. I don't care. Don't worry about it. But they were moving into a point of maturity where this is about to change. Your client's about to ask you for this stuff. You really don't know if you're going to deliver. You've been lucky so far that you've met your client's deadlines. Are you really sure that now the complexity is ramping up and the volume of change that you're dealing with, you can now meet that without having something in your back pocket to say to the client, that deadline, we're going to miss that because of all that change you've given us, or that bit over there hasn't been defined yet, so we can't achieve that. And without that controls piece to draw together a very complex program, you're just hoping. And that's what they needed to achieve, and that's what they've moved on to now.
Right. Well, I think Val might have a point to make, and then we will draw a line. Val.
Yes, it is a point in answer to Ian's comment about the guide being aimed towards the sponsoring organisation. I think what I would say is it's more aimed at making sure, like Ben said, that there's a framework in place. Because when we had at the beginning, in the early phases, like Steve said, we had somewhere nearing 200 pages of text. And that said a lot about what project controls people should do. But project controls people know what they should do. There's guides and there's all sorts of stuff out there. What they don't have, or what the way we saw it, was they didn't have a framework in which they could work in an efficient and effective way, knowing what their place was, what their lines of delegation and escalation, and at what points the project, and I think it was somebody earlier was talking about gated elements of the project and so on, making sure that the project is being controlled, and controlled isn't just at project controls level, it's at sponsor level. The senior management need to control the project as well, including deciding if scope is changed, or all the way up to whether the project gets cancelled. So if you don't have a framework in place to do that, then in my opinion, you don't have a functional project. So, and in 20 something pages, you can't describe every element of the project controls team's work, and nor would you want to, because that will change over time. So I think, but I think it would be useful for people to feedback, like Ben is, on the practicality of using it as to how the audience receives it and whether it's bought into, I guess. So I think that's where we ended up coming from as we tried to make it more concise.
I think, Val, we were trying, again, one of the objects in my head, the picture I had in my head when we were developing it, was this notion of dynamic synchronization of the organization, really webbing together the portfolio with what's going on in the upper reaches of the organization, with how that synchronizes with the effort on the shop floor down at the operational level. And what became of intense interest to me was how you described your experience, Ben, because it's all very well to sit there and pontificate about how we think it might do on paper, but to actually have that evidence-based approach of how there is definite utility within what we've produced and what you've used and discovered from that, which I think, again, in my longish term experience, and by the way, we used to call an engineer with a budget a project manager, probably still do. It's that I thought was of vast importance to bring to everybody's attention, because there hasn't really been anything like this available on this scale before. You know, it literally was the first specification type standard that had ever been produced in all the history of MS2 management standards. It had always been guidance. So if I can just, and I think that there may well be many people who've joined the call and are following this who won't have seen a copy of the standard, and they won't have seen the wonderful paper that you wrote, Ben, which you shared with me, and which absolutely was like a road to Damascus moment. Not quite road to Damascus, but it really was a fantastic way of articulating how beneficial the use of the and how it ably demonstrated the intent of what we were trying to do. It actually did. The standard did what it says on the tin, effectively. With now, so I've been coercing you to hopefully release that document as maybe the next step in the learning journey and in the conversation, if we possibly can. And I'm hopeful and optimistic. I think it may be a question of more when, and it could be quite soon. But we will endeavour to release and share that document, subject to Ben's permission, as soon as we possibly can. And also, I think, going back to your site of Val's presentation at the December Conversation Club at Oracle, that gave a pretty good outline and shape of what the standard was about. And I think, again, we should maybe dig that out again, Val, and possibly share that with the outputs and the materials that we put forward in a few days' time from this particular recording. You there, Val? Do you think is that worth just taking another look, see at what you presented?
Yeah, I put my thumb up. So
yeah. Oh, thank you. Didn't see it. Yep. Okay. So that's kind of, anything else we can chuck at it, but we'd be grateful for too. But I think, again, once you've read in conjunction with what you've heard, and maybe been able to, and I think there are some snapshots of what's in the standard in Val's presentation, joining those together, I would hope would build further your curiosity and your trust and confidence that this is a right step forward. It's actually, in my head, a standard doing what a standard, or what everybody thinks standards are about, which more often they're not, because they tend to be guidance. And referring to Ben's point, the control standard is the first of what we feel within the BSI MS2 committee will be supported and integrated with the estimating standard, which is just about to get underway, I believe. So expect that to maybe be formally published within a year or so, because a lot of upfront development work has happened. And I think the next one in line is likely to be scheduling. But again, that's moot. We still have to agree on that. But we're looking for an integrated set of specification standards. So very much account will have been taken of what's in the control standard to marry in with the estimating standard and anything else that goes forward with that. Although I would give a further advert for the recently published EVM standard, that ISO EVM standard 21508 that Ben mentioned kindly a bit earlier on, which has just been published as well, because that covers an awful lot of the integration of many of the bits and pieces that we use in controls as well. So, any final thoughts, Ben?
I'm impressed that the 50 people turned up, and there's still 21 left at this point in time. You know, I think when I finish the conversation, most people are still here. So
it's all
thank you very much for your interest.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks again, Ben, and thank you all for turning up. And watch sometime next week. We'll put out a message and hopefully start to feed additional information to build on this. And if anybody is brave enough to take a copy of this, having heard what Ben has achieved, there may be somewhere else that might like to road test this particular standard. If so, get in touch, and you may get some free help to help you push that forward as well. So thanks again. See you next time.
Very much.
Cheers all.